The ferry coughed smoke as it limped across the Black River, its boards groaning beneath the weight of years and whispers. Eleonora stood alone near the railing, her fingers curled tightly around a chipped brass pendant tucked beneath her collar, its warmth long faded. She did not look back toward the other bank. There was nothing there but the echo of old seasons, a town that had already forgotten her name, and the yawning void of empty rooms and unanswered prayers. Ahead, Eastwind Hollow crept into view, low-built houses huddled beneath heavy roofs. Chimneys like crooked fingers clawing at the pale sky, and narrow footpaths winding like veins through a land that looked half asleep. The place felt suspended in some breathless in-between, a village tucked too far from war to be wounded, and too far from fortune to be healed. She saw no one waiting on the dock when the ferry scraped against a splintered mooring post. She stepped off without ceremony, her boots meeting the damp clay with a soft thud. The air here was cooler, thinner somehow, as though it had been drained of mirth. A single gull wheeled overhead and vanished into the trees beyond the village edge, its cry lost in the hush. Eleonora adjusted the canvas sack over her shoulder, light with what little she brought, and turned toward the settlement, her jaw set. Behind her, the boatman grunted and pushed off again, without words or farewell. She did not blame him. She had long since stopped expecting kindness from strangers. Eastwind Hollow had the shape of permanence, but none of its comfort. The buildings bore the look of having stood too long. They were darkened by moss and weather, shutters nailed shut on windows that no longer opened. Chickens wandered untethered to the yards, and the smell of peat fire lingered faintly on the wind. As Eleonora passed the general store, a squat structure with faded letters worn almost invisible, she caught sight of movement behind its glass pane. A pair of eyes watched her from between lace curtains, curious, unwelcoming. She did not pause to meet the gaze. She kept walking. The room she had secured was above the cobbler's workshop, rendered by correspondence in letters stiff with formality and suspicion. A widow, she had written, though that word too had begun to wear thin with time. Her husband had been more shadow than companion, and the child they had prayed for had never come. When he fell sick and died in the spring rains 3 years prior, she buried him alone beneath a cypress tree, and no one came to grieve beside her. Since then, she had drifted between places, carried not by desire but necessity. Housekeeper here, seamstress there, her fingers always raw from labor, her voice always soft from caution. In each village she passed through, she carried the same hollow with her, disguised beneath clean aprons and careful silences. The cobbler's wife met her with a stiff nod and handed her the key without pleasantries. "You'll fetch your own water from the pump," she said. "We don't keep a maid. Churches on Sundays, markets every third day. Keep your windows closed after dusk." She said nothing more. The room was small but clean, with a sloped ceiling and a narrow bed against the far wall. A wash basin sat on a stand near the window, and a single shelf bore a vase with dry sprigs of heather. The scent of glue and leather wafted faintly upward through the floorboards. Eleonora set her sack down on the floor and sat quietly on the bed's edge, letting her hands rest in her lap. That evening, as dusk settled in violet tones across the rooftops, she walked the length of the village once more, trying to trace its boundaries, to learn its rhythm. She kept to herself, walking slowly along the unpaved paths, past shuttered shops and silent gardens, past a chapel whose bell no longer rang. At the far end of the village, the ground dipped into a long meadow, and beyond it, the river returned, wider here, moving with a sluggish grace beneath low-hanging branches. The same river she had crossed now formed the village's edge, like a line drawn in wet charcoal across the landscape. A narrow dock jutted out into the water, and used and weather-stained. She walked to its edge and sat down, letting her legs dangle above the current. The sky above had begun to dim, and the first stars emerged through the thinning clouds, distant and faint like old memories. The water below reflected them unevenly, ripples distorting their light. Eleonora looked down and saw her own reflection in the river, softened by motion, but unmistakably hers. Dark eyes, a worn mouth, hair pinned back in a way that tried to look practical but could not hide its weariness. She studied that reflection for a long time, trying to decide if she recognized it. The face she had once offered to the world had changed. Time had drawn its lines across her brow, and sorrow had dulled the spark in her gaze. She did not look like a woman arriving. She looked like one returning from war, and yet there was no one to tell her she had survived it. The stillness pressed in, heavy and unrelenting, broken only by the occasional splash of fish or the murmur of reeds brushing against each other in the wind. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, then fell silent. Eleanora let her fingers skim the dock's edge, the old wood splintering beneath her touch. She wondered who had last sat here. Had they waited for someone? Had they watched the river with hope or dread? Was this a place of partings or reunions? She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the pendant, letting it fall into her palm. The brass was worn, its surface dented with age. It had belonged to her mother once, though Eleanora had not seen her since childhood. Taken by fever, or so she had been told. She remembered little of her mother's face, only the smell of lavender and the sound of her humming while sewing in the dim light of their cottage. The pendant had passed through too many hands since then, but somehow it returned to her, a small token of lineage she barely believed in. She clutched it now, as if it could speak the word she could not. "You have to start again," she whispered, the sound almost lost in the wind. "There's nowhere else left." She did not know if she believed herself, but it was all she had. When she returned to her room, night had fallen fully, and the lamp on the shelf sputtered as she lit it. The flame cast flickering shadows across the walls, elongating her figure and dancing in the glass of the wash basin. She washed her hands and face in the cold water, then pulled the quilt over her and lay down without removing her boots. The ceiling above sloped low, pressing the dark down toward her like a shroud. She lay still, staring into the hush. There were no voices in the night, no footfalls, no dogs barking, just the slow groan of the wind moving through the chimney and the faint creak of old wood settling. She thought of the river again and the way her reflection had looked back at her, not accusing, not sorrowful, just waiting, as though something still might come. She had not wept when she buried her husband. She had not wept when she left her last post, when the family's eldest son cornered her in the pantry and whispered what she still could not speak aloud. She had not wept when the letter came refusing her application to the orphan's home. But now, in the dark, in a village that did not know her name and would not ask it twice, the tears came. Slow, hot, silent. She turned her face into the pillow and let them fall, not for what she had lost, but for how far she had wandered without anything ever truly being hers. Somewhere beyond the window, the river whispered its endless song, and Eleanora, at last, fell asleep not to silence, but to the sound of something moving, ancient and enduring, just beneath the surface. The morning broke without grandeur, pale and dim like a breath held too long. A fine mist clung to the windows of Eleanora's small upstairs room, blurring the fields beyond into soft shapes of gray and green. The air held the damp chill of early spring. And beneath the quilt, her body remained curled, reluctant to meet the cold world outside. But the bell in the chapel square rang once, just once, as if remembering its duty too late, and the village below began to stir. Footsteps creaked across frozen earth. Shutters were drawn open with groaning hinges, and somewhere beneath the eaves, a rooster made a half-hearted crow. Eleanora rose without complaint, rubbing the weight of sleep from her eyes. There had been dreams again, shapeless and slow, like trying to recall a song without melody. She set them aside, as she always did. She dressed quickly, pulling on her plain woolen skirt and the long-sleeved blouse with the cuffs worn soft at the wrists. Her fingers moved with practiced silence. The cobbler's wife did not like noise before breakfast, and Eleanora had no desire to be spoken to this early, not when her thoughts had not yet settled into proper shapes. She wound her hair into a loose knot at the nape of her neck and pinned it with the same 2 iron hairpins she had used for years. Their ends had long since dulled, and they tugged at her scalp, but she welcomed the small sting. It reminded her she was still anchored to this life. Outside, the village took form in fragments. A pair of boys rolled hoops down the lane, their laughter muffled beneath wool scarves. An old woman leaned from her stoop to sweep dry leaves into the gutter, her broom scratching across the stone. The butcher opened his doors and hung a smoke joint in the window, and steam billowed out from the baker's chimney in warm, fragrant plumes. Eleonora moved among them without ripple, a silent presence wrapped in gray shawl and watchful distance. No one greeted her. A few nodded, mostly out of habit, and some pretended not to see her at all. The unspoken question hung in the air, as it always did with strangers who lingered too long. What brought her here, and why did she come alone? The market was held in a clearing at the edge of the square, where the road widened between two alder trees, and the stone well stood crooked with age. Farmers lined the perimeter with carts full of root vegetables, loaves of dark bread, salt fish, and jars of honey whose contents had crystallized from the last harvest. Barter and small coin ruled here, and voices were low, measured tones, brisk but polite. Eleonora walked slowly through the rows, her eyes scanning for what she could afford. Her purse was light, her appetite lighter. A handful of carrots, a heel of rye, a sprig of thyme. She paused at a stall where a girl no older than 12 was selling jars of gooseberry jam. The girl smiled at Eleonora, quick and bright, then turned to serve another woman, who clutched a baby to her hip with one hand while pointing at jars with the other. That was when Eleonora felt it again, the unmistakable shift in air that came with attention not freely given. She turned her head slightly and caught the glint of a woman's eye from across the square, then another and another. A cluster of three stood near the dry goods cart, their heads close together, their faces half turned toward her, not with curiosity but with appraisal. One of them, a thick-armed woman with a child tugging at her skirts, whispered something that made the others smirk. Eleonora turned back to the stall and handed the girl a single coin for a jar of jam, though she had not planned on buying it. She hated the feel of eyes on her, that strange, glassy silence that always fell when she entered a room, the way voices shifted and stopped, as if her presence had stolen the air itself. She had known this kind of watching before. In other towns, other markets, the way people's gazes narrowed when a woman had no family to name her, no husband to ground her, no child to soften her edges. To many, a woman alone was not just a question. They thought she was a warning. There were stories whispered after nightfall of childless women who turned bitter and strange, who stirred trouble with herbs and glances, who cursed crops or stole infants in the dark. It didn't matter that Eleonora had never uttered a word out of place. It didn't matter that she walked with her head bowed and helped the cobbler's wife with washing when her back ached from rheumatism. To them, her silence was evidence, her loneliness a kind of omen, and perhaps she sometimes feared they were not entirely wrong. As she turned to leave the market, a stone clattered near her feet. It was small, no heavier than a plum, but it struck the edge of her boot before tumbling to rest on the packed dirt. Eleonora paused and looked up. A boy, perhaps 8 years old, stood half hidden behind the butcher's stall, eyes wide and face blank with the stubborn, testing gaze of a child who did not expect to be challenged. Behind him, his mother stood with her back turned, selecting cuts of meat from a bloodied table. Eleonora bent down, picked up the stone, and set it carefully on the lip of the well. She did not say a word, only looked once, level and quiet, into the boy's eyes before turning away. By the time she reached the edge of the market, the wind had picked up. It tugged at the hem of her shawl and sent the scent of peat smoke drifting through the lanes. Her basket was half full, and her steps were heavy with a kind of invisible weight that no hand could carry. She did not cry, and she did not tremble, but there was something inside her, some small, hard kernel of self, that began to shrink a little more, as though folding itself against cold that had no season. She took the long path back to the cobbler's house, skirting a road that curved around the chapel, where old headstones tilted in the moss like broken teeth. A pair of crows flew low overhead, silent, their wings slicing the gray like warnings. Inside, the room was dim and close. She set her basket on the table, then stood for a long moment, listening. The cobbler's hammer thudded rhythmically below, a slow pulse in the floorboards. The scent of leather and oil drifted upward, familiar and strange all at once. Eleonora sat by the window and stared through the misted glass, watching as two women passed below on the road, their baskets swinging, their conversation unheard. One of them glanced up and met her gaze briefly before turning away without acknowledgement. Eleonora did not flinch, but a tightness gathered behind her ribs, like the ache that comes before a storm. She turned her attention to the jam jar on the table. The label was handwritten, a child's scrawl in fading ink. She opened it and dipped the edge of a spoon inside, tasting the sweetness without ceremony. It was sharp and warm, the flavor of something made with care. She thought of the girl at the stall, how she had smiled so openly, unaware yet of how small a place like this could make a woman feel. Or perhaps she did know, and smiled in spite of it. Eleonora closed the jar and wrapped it carefully in cloth. She would save it for another day. That evening, she did not return to the river. The air had grown colder, and the sky was heavy with the promise of rain. She lit the oil lamp and mended a small tear in her shawl, her needle moving methodically through wool and silence. She thought of the stone, the way it had struck her boot and settled at her feet, not with violence but with suggestion. She thought of the boy's face, blank yet knowing. Children absorbed what was spoken behind doors and beneath breath. They learned to fear what others feared. And yet something about the way he had looked at her remained with her, long after the thread had been knotted and snipped. As night fell, Eleonora sat by the window and watched the lanterns flicker across the square. In one house, a woman lifted a child into her arms and carried them inside. In another, laughter rang out, sharp and fleeting. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barked once and then stopped. The world closed slowly, hour by hour, and Eleonora remained still, listening not for voices but for the hollow they left behind. She had no answer for the ache and no defense against it. She only knew that it would not break her. Not yet, not tomorrow, not while she still had a voice, however quiet, and hands that remembered how to hold the pieces together. And so she sat there in a hush, as the village folded itself into dreams, and the mist rolled in thick from the river, wrapping the world in its hush of breathless waiting. Before the sun had yet crested the horizon, the sky bled a pale iron hue, thick with the kind of fog that carried silence between its folds. The mist clung low to the riverbank, rising like breath from the earth itself, softening edges and swallowing sound. Eleonora stood at the edge of the reeds with her skirts hitched slightly above her ankles, her bare calves streaked with dew and mud, and her fingers numb from holding the woven net coiled over one shoulder. She had taken to fishing at dawn, not out of sport or skill, but out of need. Her money had thinned to a single coin, and though she had never been taught properly how to catch fish, she had watched others enough to know the rhythm. The river did not care if a woman was poor or childless or made strange by grief. It simply gave or withheld. She respected that. She stepped into the shallows with care, letting her weight settle against the current inch by inch. The cold was immediate and bone deep, biting up through her soles and making her gasp despite herself. The water rose just above her knees, moving with a steady, tugging insistence that tried to draw her farther, to pull her down. She planted her feet and steadied her hands as she cast the net out into the current, its thread spreading like a frail wing across the surface before dipping under and vanishing into the gloom. She waited, her eyes locked on a line as it quivered, then stilled. Minutes passed in a quiet stretch of breath and breathlessness. Her thoughts wandered as they always did in such moments, circling the same hollow paths. What she would do if she could not catch even one fish, how many days a dried rye would last, whether anyone in this place would speak to her again without suspicion in their voice. Then came the pull, not strong, not heavy, but strange, a dragging weight unlike the flutter of a fish. She braced herself and began to draw the net in, her fingers trembling from cold and anticipation. The current resisted. Her boot slipped slightly against the stones beneath her feet. She adjusted, leaned back, and hauled the net toward her. Something was caught inside, wrapped in the mesh, floating just beneath the surface. Her stomach clenched with sudden, wordless dread. She dragged it closer, and as the mass breached the water's edge, she saw the edge of the basket, wood, pale and bloated with river water, tangled in the net like driftwood. Her hands moved quickly now, instinct overriding sense. She pulled the basket onto bank and knelt beside it, panting. The reeds rustled behind her as she worked her fingers through the netting, prying it free from a weave of willow slats. The basket wobbled as she lifted the lid. The world fell silent. Inside, nestled in damp linen, lay 3 infants. Their skin was pale from cold, but they moved, each of them writhing slightly, mouths opening and closing like small birds. One let out a thin, reedy wail, so weak it barely stirred the mist. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the ground beside the basket, her hands trembling. She reached for them with both awe and fear, half expecting the vision to vanish, to dissolve into water or light or dream. But they were real. 3 babies, no more than a few days old. One had a tuft of dark hair slicked his brow, another a red thread tied loosely around her wrist, the third with eyes wide open, already watching her as if she were expected. For a moment she did not move. The river behind her murmured, constant and uncaring. The reeds whispered among themselves. Her own heart was a thunder in her chest. She reached into the basket and touched the smallest of them, her fingers brushing against a cheek that was soft and shockingly warm despite the chill. The baby turned toward her touch. Eleanor let out a low sound, not quite a sob, not quite a prayer. She wrapped all 3 in the outer layers of her shawl, lifting the bundle carefully against her chest. They were impossibly light and yet so heavy in her arms, heavy with meaning, with consequence, with the shattering of everything she had quietly built around her emptiness. She could feel their breath against her skin, damp and uncertain, but real, alive. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath the weight of her soaked skirts, and turned toward the path that led back to the village. Her mind raced even as her body moved on instinct. Who would leave them here? Why 3? Why the river? The morning thickened as she walked, the fog swallowing the trees around her and deadening every footstep into silence. She clutched the babies to her chest and moved with purpose, though her thoughts spiraled into chaos. There were no answers yet, only questions too wide to carry. By the time she reached the edge of the village, the mist had begun to lift, and the first signs of life stirred behind curtained windows. A curtain twitched, a door creaked open and shut. Somewhere, a bell began to ring, marking the hour. She did not stop to look at anyone. She kept her gaze forward, her arms folded tight around the bundle, her breath coming in short, deliberate gasps. At the door to her room, she fumbled with the key, nearly dropping it twice before managing to open the latch. Once inside, she laid the bundle on her narrow bed and unwrapped the shawl with trembling fingers. The 3 of them squirmed in the weak morning light, their limbs stretching like petals unfurling in a cold spring. They were quiet now, alert. Their eyes searched the room, the ceiling, her face. She moved quickly to stoke the small fire in the corner and heat water in the tin kettle. She boiled a rag, tore an old shirt into strips, and fashioned makeshift diapers from what fabric she could spare. Her hands worked faster than her thoughts, driven by some deep, buried memory of care. She had never raised a child. She had never even held one for more than a moment, but something in her bones knew what to do. She cleaned them one by one, marveling at the smallness of their hands, the curve of their ears, the way their fingers instinctively curled around hers. She named them aloud as she worked, though the names came not from logic, but from something older, something shaped by rhythm and feeling. "This one," she said softly, brushing the hair from the first baby's forehead, "you'll be called Nessa." She turned to the second, the one with the red thread. "And you, Mira." The third, the watcher, she hesitated over. His eyes met hers, dark and solemn. "And you'll be Bram." The names felt true the moment they left her lips. They were names with breath in them. As the fire warmed the small room, Eleanor fed them drops of warm milk from a soaked cloth, swaying gently as she cradled each one, her voice a low murmur of comfort and half-remembered lullabies. They drank slowly, their mouths searching and impatient. When they slept, she did not. She sat beside the bed and watched their chests rise and fall, the rhythm as fragile and sacred as the breath of prayer. Her heart, once a quiet and withered thing inside her chest, now beat with strained ferocity as it pulled forward into life again by their need. The emptiness she had carried for so long was still there, but no longer alone. It was now shared, broken open by the shock of this mercy. She did not yet understand what this would mean. She did not know what the village would say or do. She did not know who might come looking, or whether she had the strength to defend them when they did. But as the morning light widened across the floorboards and the sound of footsteps resumed outside, Eleanor sat still in hush, her arms aching from holding, her soul trembling from a kind of wonder she had never allowed herself to imagine. They had come to her in the river, as if delivered by the current itself, as if the water had chosen her to carry what someone else could not. And for the first time in years, she did not feel like a woman drifting between places. She felt like a beginning. Night settled into East Wind Hollow, not with drama or thunder, but with the slow, deliberate grace of a lantern being dimmed. The sky turned the color of steeped tea, the stars emerging one by one, faint and trembling. A chill seeped into the corners of Eleanor's room, creeping through the old window panes, rustling the edge of the rug near the hearth. The fire she had coaxed into life earlier burned low now, soft with ember glow, casting orange light that flickered against the low ceiling beams and gently rocked the cradle she had fashioned hours before from a broken drawer, linen wraps, and lengths of twine. It swayed with rhythm so subtle it could have been imagined, but inside it, the three infants lay in a tangle of tiny limbs in deep, dreamless sleep. Eleanor sat beside them on the floor, her back against the leg of the bed, her head resting against the wall, eyes wide and unblinking. She could not yet bring herself to sleep. She had spent the day moving through the hours like someone walking through water, every gesture slowed, weighted by awe and uncertainty. Her body ached in places she had long stopped feeling, her lower back from bending over cradle, her arms from holding them close for so long, her fingers rubbed raw from scrubbing cloths in cold water, twisting them dry by the hearth. And yet none of it felt like labor. It felt like remembering, as though her body had always known this work and had only been waiting to begin it. She had burned her hands briefly on the kettle, and one of the babies, Mira, she thought, had cried loud and sudden at the clatter. Eleanor had dropped to her knees and scooped her up, pressing her cheek to the infant's crown, murmuring soft apologies even as her own eyes welled with tears she could not name. It was not fear that undid her. It was the overwhelming realization that she could soothe the crying, that her voice meant something, that her hands, these hands that had been idle for so long, used only for cleaning other people's dishes or mending other people's coats, could now cradle something sacred and be the first shape of comfort that three human beings would ever know. When they had all fed and been changed and laid down again, she had built the cradle, cobbled together from what little she had. She had gone to the riverbank and gathered bark and soft moss, tying it in bundles beneath the linen to give the base some warmth. She wrapped each of them in the finest cloth she owned, the linen hand-stitched with a faded blue border, once a wedding gift from a neighbor long forgotten. She murmured their names again and again as she worked, Nessa, Mira, Bram, like incantations, as though repetition would keep them alive through the night. Naming them had anchored her in ways she hadn't expected. They were no longer just foundlings or burdens or miracles. They were people, individuals, each with their own breath and weight and need. And she was no longer just a stranger with empty arms. She was a caretaker, perhaps even a mother, the word still caught in her throat. Beyond the thin window glass, the village had fallen silent. A wind had picked up from the north, brushing through the trees in long, mournful sighs. The branches scratched against one another like brittle fingers. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice and then stopped. Eleanor listened to the night the way one listens to an unfamiliar room, ears tuned not for danger but for change. She had lived many nights in silence, but this one was different. This one contained meaning. This one had a center, a hearth, something to protect. She felt in the rhythm of their breathing, in the soft shifting of small bodies as they dreamed of whatever babies dream, warmth perhaps, or the sound of a heartbeat close to their ear. Night settled into East Wind Hollow, not with drama or thunder, but with the slow, deliberate grace of a lantern being dimmed. The sky turned the color of steeped tea, the stars emerging one by one, faint and trembling. A chill seeped into the corners of Eleanor's room, creeping through the old window panes, rustling the edge of the rug near the hearth. The fire she had coaxed into life earlier burned low now, soft with ember glow, casting orange light that flickered against the low ceiling beams and gently rocked the cradle she had fashioned hours before from a broken drawer, linen wraps, and lengths of twine. It swayed with rhythm so subtle it could have been imagined, but inside it, the three infants lay in a tangle of tiny limbs in deep, dreamless sleep. Eleanor sat beside them on the floor, her back against the leg of the bed, her head resting against the wall, eyes wide and unblinking. She could not yet bring herself to sleep. She had spent the day moving through the hours like someone walking through water. Every gesture slowed, weighted by awe and uncertainty. Her body ached in places she had long stopped feeling. Her lower back from bending over the cradle, her arms from holding them close for so long, her fingers rubbed raw from scrubbing cloths in cold water, twisting them dry by the hearth. And yet none of it felt like labor. It felt like remembering, as though her body had always known this work and had only been waiting to begin it. She had burned her hands briefly on the kettle, and one of the babies, Mira, she thought, had cried loud and sudden at the clatter. Eleanor had dropped to her knees and scooped her up, pressing her cheek to the infant's crown, murmuring soft apologies, even as her own eyes welled with tears she could not name. It was not fear that undid her. It was the overwhelming realization that she could soothe the crying, that her voice meant something, that her hands, these hands that had been idle for so long, used only for cleaning other people's dishes or mending other people's coats, could now cradle something sacred and be the first shape of comfort that three human beings would ever know. When they had all fed and been changed and laid down again, she had built the cradle, cobbled together from what little she had. She had gone to the riverbank and gathered bark and soft moss, tying it in bundles beneath the linen to give the base some warmth. She wrapped each of them in the finest cloth she owned, the linen hand-stitched with a faded blue border, once a wedding gift from a neighbor long forgotten. She murmured their names again and again as she worked, Nessa, Mira, Bram, like incantations, as though repetition would keep them alive through the night. Naming them had anchored her in ways she hadn't expected. They were no longer just foundlings or burdens or miracles. They were people, individuals, each with their own breath and weight and need. And she was no longer just a stranger with empty arms. She was a caretaker, perhaps even a mother, the word still caught in her throat. Beyond the thin window glass, the village had fallen silent. A wind had picked up from the north, brushing through the trees in long, mournful sighs. The branches scratched against one another like brittle fingers. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice and then stopped. Eleanor listened to the night the way one listens to an unfamiliar room, ears tuned not for danger but for change. She had lived many nights in silence, but this one was different. This one contained meaning. This one had a center, a hearth, something to protect. She felt in the rhythm of their breathing, in the soft shifting of small bodies, as they dreamed of whatever babies dream, warmth perhaps, or the sound of a heartbeat close to their ear. She thought of the river and how it had looked that morning, veiled in mist and mystery. How easily she could have missed the basket. A few moments earlier or later, a shift in current, a breath of hesitation, and they would not have been found. The thought twisted in her chest with such force, she had to reach out and lay her hand lightly on the edge of the cradle, as if to tether them again to the world, to her. She did not believe in fate, not in the way old women at the chapel muttered about it, not in a script written by some distant god, but she believed in the river, and the way grief carves a hollow inside you that sometimes becomes the very shape of grace. She believed that their cries had called to her because they were meant to be answered, and no one else had come. She would not tell the village. Not yet, not while the shape of this miracle was still forming. She knew too well how suspicion would rise before compassion. Stray children were a threat in a place like this, a question too messy for small minds. They would ask whose they were and how she came by them. They would wonder if she had stolen them. Or it began with rain, thin at first, then heavier, turning the sky into a shroud of slate and sending rivulets of water down every sill and roofline in East Wind Hollow. The drops fell with a rhythm both mournful and relentless, drumming against the cobbler's window panes like insistent fingers. Eleanor stood in the dim morning light, holding Bram against her shoulder, his small hand clutching the edge of her collar. Mira and Nessa slept together in the cradle beneath a patched wool blanket, their cheeks flushed from the warmth of the fire. She rocked gently from heel to toe, her thoughts thick with the fog that settled along the floorboards. It was a day that pulled the world inward, A day for quiet. But quiet, as she had learned, often carried its own kind of threat. The news had spread faster than she expected. She hadn't told a soul, had kept the door closed, the shutters drawn, her errands short and purposeful. And yet something had shifted in the way people looked at her. Yesterday, when she passed the baker's stall, the woman had turned her back entirely, her shoulders rigid as stone. At the pump near the well, two girls who once offered faint nods now giggled into their palms and whispered behind their braids as Eleanora filled her pail. A man she had once bartered a basket from wouldn't meet her eyes when she tried to thank him. She began to see it in places where she hadn't before. Shadows of hesitation, glances that lingered too long, silences pressed too tightly between greetings. Something in her had changed, yes, but the village did not welcome it. She had tried to be discreet, covering the cradle with a cloth when neighbors passed, holding only one baby at a time in view, whispering lullabies instead of singing. But the sounds of infancy were not easily concealed. A sudden cry in the middle of the night, the rustle of small limbs against cotton, the smell of warm milk escaping through the eaves. All of it betrayed her. People noticed things. People spoke. And in a place like Eastwind Hollow, where tradition held more sway than truth, a woman who lived alone and had suddenly, without ceremony or explanation, become the guardian of 3 infants was not a woman to be left unexamined. By mid-morning, the knock came, not loud but firm. Bram stirred against her shoulder, and Eleanora pressed him closer to her chest, his warmth grounding her as she moved toward the door. She opened it only slightly. Outside stood Mara Tullen, the wife of the chapel deacon, wrapped in a black cloak lined with fox fur and holding a thick umbrella like a scepter. Behind her, 3 others stood, 2 women and a man, all dressed as if the rain could not touch them. Their faces were composed, lips pursed in the kind of expression reserved for funerals and unwanted visits. Mara's eyes did not wander. They went straight to Eleanora's arms. "Good morning, Miss Eleanora," she said, voice smooth and unhurried, as though she were commenting on the weather and not the child resting against her. "We've come because there have been questions. You understand, I'm sure." Eleanora said nothing at first. She adjusted Bram gently, his small breath hot against her neck, and nodded once, barely. She did not open the door wider. "Some of the neighbors," Mara continued, "have heard the sound of children more than once. And yet no one seems to recall seeing you leave pregnant or return with kin. And as you know, a matter like this must be brought before the town elders if it concerns the safety of orphans, or, God forbid, if anything improper has occurred." The word improper hung in the air like smoke, curling against the eaves. Eleanora felt her jaw tighten, not in anger, but in restraint. She wanted to say that nothing had occurred except mercy, that the river had delivered them to her doorstep, and she had done what any living soul should do: lift them from the water, warm them, feed them, protect them. But she knew the village would not hear that story with grace. They wanted names, papers, explanations. They wanted facts dressed in politeness and gratitude. What she had was a basket soaked in silt and 3 infants who only now had names. "I found them," she said finally, her voice low but steady. 3 days ago, at the river, left in a basket. I brought them home." The man at the back, a stout fellow with muddy boots and a worn cap, scoffed audibly. One of the women leaned toward Mara and whispered something too quickly for Eleanora to catch. But Mara's eyes never left her. "That's quite a tale," she said, not unkindly, but with the practiced poise of someone who believed compassion must be earned. "And you've told no one? No report to the deacon? No notice posted in the square? Not even an inquiry made at the council's registry?" Eleanora shook her head. "I was trying to keep them safe. They were cold. They were hungry. I didn't want to delay." Mara's lips tightened, though whether from disapproval or deliberation, Eleanora could not tell. The rain dripped steadily from the brim of her umbrella, falling in neat lines that splashed against the doorstep. Behind her, the other faces waited, unmoved. "We'll need to notify the council," Mara said at last. "And the physician. These children must be examined. There may be illness, and we must be sure they haven't been taken." Eleanora flinched then, not visibly, but inwardly where it hurt most. The implication was clear: stolen, as though she had crept into some cradle in the dark and made off with what she could never birth herself. She wanted to defend herself, to shout, to name the injustice, but she knew the cost. Anger would confirm their worst suspicions. Softness was the only armor she had. "I understand," she said quietly, "but please let them sleep today. Come tomorrow. I will answer your questions." Mara studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well. Tomorrow, after the bells." And they left, vanishing back into the rain with the silence of verdicts already forming. Eleonora closed the door and leaned against it, her knees trembling. Bram had fallen asleep again, his small breath steady against her collarbone. She clutched him tighter and let her eyes close, just for a moment, to steady herself. She had known there would be questions, but she had not expected the chill of accusation so soon. In the quiet that followed, she returned to the cradle and sat on the floor beside it, laying Bram down gently between his sisters. They stirred briefly, then settled, unaware of the world's turning. All day she waited. Each creak of the floorboards downstairs, each step on the street below, made her nerves rise like startled birds. She fed them in shifts, changed their wrappings, hummed lullabies not out of joy but out of necessity, her voice the only sound that kept her tethered to the moment. She did not cry. There was no time for tears, only preparation. That night, she gathered everything she could to show the council. The basket, still damp at the base, the cloth they'd been wrapped in, the red thread tied around Myra's wrist, the impressions left in the net she'd pulled from the river. She wrote down every detail she could recall, her handwriting small but deliberate. She did not expect mercy, but she would offer truth in full. When the rain finally broke, long after midnight, the wind carried with it the scent of damp soil and wild heather. The world smelled new again, but Eleonora felt older than ever. She sat by the fire, holding Mira now, whose eyelids fluttered with dreams, and stared into the embers until the shapes within them turned to visions of judgment, of defense, of 3 infants born not from her body, but from something just as sacred: the choice to love without permission. She knew what tomorrow would bring, not just the questions, but the coldness beneath them. The council would measure her story against what they found acceptable, and many would not believe. They would think her desperate. They would think her touched. Some might even say wicked. But as Myra's tiny hand curled against her own, Eleonora felt something deepen inside her, a kind of stillness lined with iron. She had saved them. She would save them again. And if the village chose to mock her, to cast her out or brand her with suspicion, she would not yield. She had weathered worse silences. She had lived through colder seasons. But never before had she lived with purpose. The triplets had given her that. And now they would not be taken. Not by doubt, not by rumor, not by fear. She would rise to meet the council, not as a beggar, not as a stranger, but as their mother, not by law, not by blood, but by the truest measure she knew: love that refuses to be undone. The council hall stood at the heart of Eastwind Hollow like a bone left exposed to the weather, bleached, silent, and too long unbothered. It was not a place of warmth or grandeur, but of judgment tempered by tradition. Its low stone walls covered in creeping ivy, and its wooden eaves sagging beneath the weight of seasons past. The bell above the doorway rang once, just after the sun broke through the thinning morning fog, calling the council members from their breakfast tables and prayer benches, from their shops and sheds, into the cold formality of the chamber. Eleonora stood at the edge of the square, holding Mira against her chest and watching the others pass her by, their eyes never quite meeting hers, their hands folded or tucked into their sleeves, their mouths tight with a kind of silence that does not invite comfort. She had not slept. The night had stretched endlessly, broken only by the cries of the children and her own thoughts circling like moths around a flame that never fully caught. She had packed a bundle before dawn: the basket, scrubbed clean and lined with the river warp cloth, the shawl they'd been wrapped in, the net, still bearing traces of silt in its knots, and her written account, folded carefully and tied with twine. She brought Bram and Nessa to the cobbler's wife with a soft word and a plea for only an hour's care. The woman had grunted but accepted them without comment, her mouth pinched as if holding back something heavier than opinion. East Wind Hollow had begun to turn against her, but had not yet closed its door. Inside the hall, the air smelled of old dust and mildew, of the smoke from countless meetings and the parchment of forgotten decrees. At the far end of the room sat the council, 7 in total, their faces familiar in the way bricks are familiar, unmoving, shaped by time and pressure rather than kindness. Mara Tulin sat at the center, her hair pinned high and her gloves still on, as if the cold of her entrance had never left her bones. Beside her sat Elias Vorn, the blacksmith's elder brother, whose voice could still shake timber beams, and Ansel Dree, the oldest of them all, whose eyes were milk-white with age but whose mind had never faltered. The others were a blend of stiff collars, judgment, and carefully concealed unease. They watched Eleonora approach without greeting, their expressions unreadable. She stood before them, Mira asleep against her chest, her own heart racing not with fear, but with the unbearable tension of being seen without welcome. She waited, because that was the custom. No one spoke until Mara gave the nod. It came after a long minute. "You may begin," Mara said, folded her hands atop her lap, her voice as steady as polished stone. Eleonora took a breath, not too deep. She had rehearsed this moment, not for performance, but to steady the tremor beneath her ribs. She began with the river, how she had gone to fish, how the basket had caught in her net, how she had found the babies inside, alive, wet, wrapped in linen, their cries weak but clear. She recounted how she had brought them home, warmed them by her fire, fed them cloth-soaked milk from her hand, wrapped them in her last clean linens, and how they had quieted in her arms. She did not embellish. She did not plead. She told the truth, the whole of it, even the parts that frightened her, how she had not told anyone, not right away, because she feared what the village would think, what they might try to take from her before they understood. When she finished, she stepped forward and placed a bundle on the table before the council. Basket, net, cloth, all laid bare like offerings. Mira stirred faintly but did not cry. The room was silent, not the silence of awe or respect, but the kind that signals calculation. Each council member seemed to be weighing her words against something else, some invisible measure of logic, morality, and fear. Eleonora could feel it, the shift in the air, the rustling tension of doubt as it bloomed. Elias Vorn leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "And you swear you did not recognize these children? That you have no knowledge of who might have left them there?" "I swear it," she answered, her voice unshaking. There was no one else, no sign, only the river. Ansel Dree's voice came next, low and cracked with age. It would not be the first time a child was hidden from shame, then turned loose. But 3? That's not something done lightly. "They were meant to die," Mara said softly, not as a question but as a statement. "Left in a river. It would have taken only hours." Eleonora looked at her then, held her gaze with something quiet and raw. "And they did not. They lived, because someone pulled them out." A murmur moved along the row. The man in the brown coat, Benedict Grau, spoke next, a touch of condescension in his voice. "And you, a woman with no husband, no family, no ties to this village beyond tenancy, you believe yourself suited to raise 3 infants? Alone?" "I don't know if I am suited," she said, her voice lowering slightly. "But I know I already have. For 4 days now, they have eaten in my arms, slept against my chest, been held when they cried. I know their breathing. I know their weight. They are not strangers to me anymore." "You speak as though love makes you mother," Mara replied. Eleonora did not flinch. "It does. In the absence of anything else, it must." The silence that followed was different now, heavier. There was discomfort in the air, yes, but also something else, an undercurrent of recognition. These were people who had known loss, who had buried children in winters past, who had heard stories of infants left on church steps during famines, who had been raised themselves by second mothers and aging aunts. The structure of the law was rigid, but the memory of grief was not. And still, Eleonora could see the doubt. They were not ready to say yes. "Not yet. We must consult with the healer," Mara said at last. "The children must be examined. We must search the riverbanks for signs of origin. A message, a trail, anything. If these children were abandoned unlawfully, if their mother lives and wishes them returned, then you cannot keep them. That is the law. And if no one comes, Eleonora asked, then we will decide. Elias answered, in time. Eleonora nodded once. She knew that time would stretch. That suspicion did not loosen easily, that this village had never welcomed her fully, and perhaps never would. But she also knew she had placed a stone in the river's current. The truth had been spoken. The net had been laid out. She had not been silent. For now, that had to be enough. They dismissed her with a wave, not unkind, but firm. As she turned to leave, Mira stirred again, her eyes fluttering open to take in the flickering lanterns above. Eleonora kissed the crown of her head and whispered her name. Outside, the day had brightened, but only slightly. Clouds still lingered, and the wind had turned chill. People had gathered near the well, waiting, watching. She felt their eyes on her as she walked back across the square, the basket under one arm, Mira against her chest, her steps slow but certain. They whispered, but no longer with surprise. Now it was with something else, uncertainty, perhaps, wonder, fear dressed in curiosity. She let it all pass over her. She did not answer. She did not meet their gazes. She returned to the cobbler's door and climbed the narrow stairs to her room. Inside, the fire still burned, and Bram and Nessa lay sleeping in their makeshift cradle, their limbs tangled in shared warmth. She joined them, placed Mira beside her siblings, and sank to the floor beside the hearth. The emberlight played across her face, casting shadows that did not feel ominous, only real. Her body was weary, her voice spent, but something inside her had settled. The truth had been spoken. The children were still hers, for now, and she would not let them go. Not to fear, not to gossip, not to the past. Let the council deliberate. Let the village speak. She had crossed the threshold of silence, and she would not return. Her arms were no longer empty, her home no longer hollow, and the children, whose names she had given voice to, had become her anchor in a world that once tried to carry her away. The river had always spoken in riddles. Long before Eleonora had ever set foot in Eastwind Hollow, before she had ever heard its name murmured through the brittle mouths of travel-weary women in market squares, or seen it traced along yellowed maps hung in taverns, the river had already whispered its truths into the soil and stone of the valley. It carved the land not in violence, but in persistence, shaping it slowly, deliberately, washing over roots and rocks alike until all things gave way to its rhythm. Now, as dawn lit the eastern sky in brushstrokes of pale gold and pearl gray, Eleonora stood once more at the water's edge, barefoot in the frost-laced grass, her skirts damp at the hem, the triplets bundled tightly against her chest in a worn sling tied across her back and shoulders. The council had not yet rendered judgment. A week had passed since she had stood in the old stone hall and placed her truth before them like a meal left out in hope. They had examined the children, questioned her again, questioned the cobbler's wife, even sent a young boy to follow her once, clumsy in his attempt at discretion. And though none had come forward to claim the triplets, and no trace of their origin had been found, no burial discarded linen, no tracks along the reed beds, no mark of desperate hands left behind in the dirt, the silence of the council was beginning to gather weight. She had waited. She had fed and bathed and sung and rocked and shushed, her days shaped not by bells or hours, but by hunger and breath and a hush between cries. But now, on this morning, she felt something shift inside her. Not urgency, not defiance. Something older, like the voice of her mother, like the wind that moves just before snow falls. A calling. She would return them to the river, not to give them back, but to make a vow. The path was long, winding away from the cottages and down through the fields where the last frost clung to the hollowed rows of winter turnip and cabbage. The air smelled of moss and smoke, faintly sweet from a nearby pile of damp leaves set to burn. She walked slowly, every footfall careful, as if she feared the earth might rise to meet her with resistance. The sling was warm against her spine, the weight of the baby's balanced and familiar now, as natural as her own breath. Bram whimpered once, and she pressed a hand gently against him through the cloth, whispering nothing, only letting her touch assure him. They had not known the river beyond the moment of their finding. She did not know if they remembered its coldness, its silence, but she remembered. She remembered the way their cries had cut through the fog, the moment her fingers brushed the damp basket, the terrible beauty of those wide, waiting eyes. The river had spoken first. Now she would answer. When she reached the bank, she stopped. The water moved slowly, dark and glass-like, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple where fish or wind disturbed it. The same dock leaned out over the current. Its wood softened with age, its posts bent inward like a bow back. She stepped onto it with care, the boards creaking softly beneath her, and moved to its farthest edge. From here, the river widened, catching the morning light in streaks of silver. Across the water, the far bank was cloaked in a thin mist, the trees beyond it indistinct and dreaming. It felt like standing at the edge of a world not entirely her own. She knelt. It took time. Her knees were stiff from nights spent beside the cradle, her back weary with hours of bending, lifting, soothing. But she did not rush. The river had always spoken in riddles. Long before Eleanor had ever set foot in Eastwind Hollow, before she had ever heard its name murmured through the brittle mouths of travel-weary women in market squares, or seen it traced along yellowed maps hung in taverns, the river had already whispered its truths into the soil and stone of the valley. It carved the land not in violence, but in persistence, shaping it slowly, deliberately, washing over roots and rocks alike until all things gave way to its rhythm. Now, as dawn lit the eastern sky in brushstrokes of pale gold and pearl gray, Eleanor stood once more at the water's edge, barefoot in the frost-laced grass, her skirts damp at the hem, the triplets bundled tightly against her chest in a worn sling tied across her back and shoulders. The council had not yet rendered judgment. A week had passed since she had stood in the old stone hall and placed her truth before them like a meal left out in hope. They had examined the children, questioned her again, questioned the cobbler's wife, even sent a young boy to follow her once, clumsy in his attempt at discretion. And though none had come forward to claim the triplets, and no trace of their origin had been found, no burial of discarded linen, no tracks along the reed beds, no mark of desperate hands left behind in the dirt, the silence of the council was beginning to gather weight. She had waited. She had fed and bathed and sung and rocked and shushed, her days shaped not by bells or hours, but by hunger and breath and a hush between cries. But now, on this morning, she felt something shift inside her. Not urgency, not defiance. Something older, like the voice of her mother, like the wind that moves just before snow falls. A calling. She would return them to the river, not to give them back, but to make a vow. The path was long, winding away from the cottages and down through the fields where the last frost clung to the hollowed rows of winter turnip and cabbage. The air smelled of moss and smoke, faintly sweet from a nearby pile of damp leaves set to burn. She walked slowly, every footfall careful, as if she feared the earth might rise to meet her with resistance. The sling was warm against her spine, the weight of the baby's balanced and familiar now, as natural as her own breath. Bram whimpered once, and she pressed a hand gently against him through the cloth, whispering nothing, only letting her touch assure him. They had not known the river beyond the moment of their finding. She did not know if they remembered its coldness, its silence, but she remembered. She remembered the way their cries had cut through the fog, the moment her fingers brushed the damp basket, the terrible beauty of those wide, waiting eyes. The river had spoken first. Now she would answer. When she reached the bank, she stopped. The water moved slowly, dark and glass-like, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple where fish or wind disturbed it. The same dock leaned out over the current. Its wood softened with age, its posts bent inward like a bow back. She stepped onto it with care, the boards creaking softly beneath her, and moved to its farthest edge. From here, the river widened, catching the morning light in streaks of silver. Across the water, the far bank was cloaked in a thin mist, the trees beyond it indistinct and dreaming. It felt like standing at the edge of a world not entirely her own. She knelt. It took time. Her knees were stiff from nights spent beside the cradle, her back weary with hours of bending, lifting, soothing. But she did not rush. Once settled, she loosened the sling, cradled each child in the curve of her arms, and placed them on the blanket she had spread before her. Soft wool, washed and worn, frayed at the corners. They blinked up at the sky, content, their faces still drowsy from the warmth of her body. She folded her hands in her lap. She did not pray, not in the way the chapel taught, not with rehearsed words or bowed head. She spoke plainly, softly, the way she once spoke to the river as a girl, when she would stand alone on the banks behind her childhood home and cast pebbles into the current, pretending her questions could be carried to someone listening. "I don't know who they came from," she said. "I don't know why they were left. I only know I was there, and I pulled them out. That's what I was given. That's what I choose." Her voice wavered. She paused and reached down to adjust Nessa's blanket. The baby kicked once, then stilled again. "I've never had much," she continued. "Not land, not name, not family. I've tried to live quietly. Try not to want too much. But I cannot pretend I don't want this. Not anymore." She looked out across the water, her eyes catching on the shifting reflection of the trees above. "I will raise them, even if the council says no, even if the village turns its back. I will find a way, because I heard them first. Not God, not a mother hiding in shame. Me." The bonfire stood tall and waiting before it burned. Its shape was crude, built by strong hands and an old memory of how things used to be. Thick logs stacked in a pyramid, dried kindling packed into its heart, the top crowned with branches wrapped in oilcloth. It had not been lit in years. Most of Eastwind Hollow had forgotten why it was ever built in the first place. Some said it had once marked midsummer celebrations. Others whispered of darker purposes, of a time when it was used to drive away sickness or shame or to send a warning. But no one had touched the firewood in nearly a decade. Until now, they gathered before it in the square, a ring of villagers standing just beyond the reach of the shadow it cast. The children were nowhere to be seen, nor the very old. Only the able-bodied had come, called by murmured instruction and the slow, quiet gathering of opinion. Word had spread that the council had not yet declared Eleonora's fate, that she continued to keep the triplets in her care, that the church had grown silent, that even Mara Tulin had said no more. When the fire was stacked in the morning, no reason was given aloud, and yet the village came, because when a question lingers too long unanswered, people will find a flame and set it to something, even if they do not yet know what it is they wish to destroy. Eleonora stood at the edge of the crowd, the triplets cradled against her in the sling, wrapped tightly in wool and pressed to her heart. The smoke had not yet risen, but she could already smell the pitch of it, could feel the heat waiting to be released. Her heart beat evenly, not from calm, but from resolve. This moment had come not with surprise, but with a slow inevitability of snow falling onto thawless ground. She had seen the looks change in recent days, the open suspicions softening into hesitation, the pointed questions replaced by muttering half-truths. But there were still those who clung to old certainties, who saw her presence as a stain on their still water, and they had waited long enough for permission to act. The fire had never needed her name spoken aloud to mean her. The council had not summoned her. No judgment had been passed. And yet here they were, called by no law, but by ritual. She watched Elias Vorn strike the match and hold it steady beneath the oil-soaked cloth at the tip. His hand did not tremble. The fire caught quickly, the flame blooming with an orange breath, the dry branches crackling as if relieved to be summoned back into purpose. The smoke rose into the sky in a dark ribbon. Some turned their faces away, but most did not. They watched the fire like a question, and then turned, almost as one, to her. No one said her name, but someone called out, "It isn't right." It was a man's voice, raw, uncertain, but loud enough to break the stillness. Another murmured behind him. A woman near the edge shook her head. Someone else nodded. That was all. No shouts, no stones, just breath and murmur and fire. Eleonora stepped forward. She did not know what she meant to say, only that she could not remain still. Not now. Not when the children she carried had been born into silence once already. She moved past the outer ring of villagers, past the tight-mouthed stares and averted eyes. Her feet moved steadily, though each step carried the weight of memory and every unspoken grief that had brought her here. When she reached the fire, she stood before it with the full light of it against her face, the heat rising to meet her like a hand to the throat. She did not flinch, Mira stirred against her chest, letting out a small, startled breath. Eleonora placed a hand gently across the sling and held her close. "I know why you built it," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. "I know what it's meant to do. You think if you burn something, some idea, some threat, it will leave your minds, that you will sleep easier, that the world will become simple again." No one answered. The fire crackled behind her. "You think what I've done is strange," she continued. "You think a woman with no child should not have three, that I've broken some law you keep in your hearts. Maybe I have, but if I have, then so has a river, and so has mercy." She took another step forward, and this time, her voice grew sharper. Not cruel, not loud, but shaped by steel beneath the quiet. "Tell me, who among you would have walked past that basket? Who would have let them drift? Would you have said a prayer and left them to the cold? Would that have satisfied your idea of order? Would that have kept your village clean?" Someone coughed. Someone else shifted. The fire spat sparks into the air. "I did not take them because I was lonely. I did not feed them because I pitied them. I did not name them because I want to play at being a mother. I did it because they needed someone. That is all. No magic, no madness, just need." She paused, letting her words settle. "There are laws. I know. I've broken none. There are fears. I see them. I've answered none of them. But there is also choice, and I made mine." She turned slightly, letting those in the back see the children. Myra's fingers curled into her collar. Nessa's eyes half open in the wool folds. Bram's breath soft and even. These children have no curse upon them. They are not signs. They are not warnings. They are only small, only alive. They cry when they are cold. They smile when they are held. They dream. Her voice wavered now, but not from weakness, from the fullness of holding so much inside her chest that she feared she might split. "I would burn 1,000 fires to keep them warm," she said. "I would face all of you again and again until your silence broke and your hearts remembered what it means to care without permission." The wind shifted then, blowing the smoke sideways, and the fire's heat hit the side of her face with sudden intensity. She did not step back. She let it rise, let it sting, let it bear witness. Mara Tulin stepped out from the edge of the crowd. She wore no cloak today, no gloves. Her hands were bare. She moved slowly, without grandeur, until she stood beside Eleonora. They did not speak. Mara turned to face the crowd and held out her hand. "She has spoken," Mara said. "Simply, let us now decide who we are." No one moved at first. Then Elias Vorn stepped forward, not to join them, but to lower the torch he had carried, to douse it. One by one, others stepped back from the fire, not in shame, but in release. The flame still burned, but now it did not accuse. It warmed. It illuminated. Eleonora stood there until the last spark dimmed. The triplets slept again, untouched by the fire's intent. When she turned to go, she did not look to see who watched. She did not need to. The fire had burned what it needed to. Fear, suspicion, the comfort of inaction. In its place remained only ash and the quiet hum of something new, something growing. As she walked home, her arms were not lighter, but they no longer ached in the same way. The path beneath her feet had not changed, but her step pressed into it with purpose. She would still be doubted, still be questioned, but now, the fire that burned behind her belonged not to her condemnation, but to her defense. It had not been lit to destroy her. It had revealed her, and in the hush that followed, something like belief began to rise, not just in others, but in herself. The first frost of winter came in silence. It painted the village roofs with a fine white breath, a lace of ice that traced the eaves and edges with the steady patience of time. Each blade of grass stood rimmed in silver, and the brittle skeletons of summer's flowers glinted in the dim morning light like forgotten jewelry. The windows of Eastwind Hollow fogged from within, and the smoke from every chimney rose slow and heavy, blending into a pale sky that held a hush of snow not yet fallen. The stillness of the season had returned, and in it, something softer had begun to take root in the bones of the village, quiet and hesitant, but present. Not everyone spoke it aloud, But there was no longer any doubt. Eleonora remained. She had not left after the fire, nor had she been asked to. No judgment had been passed by council or priest. There had been no letter pinned to her door, no final meeting held in cold rooms beneath oil lamps. Instead, there had been the slow and uncertain return of presence, a knock at the door with an extra loaf of rye, a folded quilt left on her stoop with no name stitched into the corner, a nod in the market, brief but real. These were not gestures of apology. They were smaller than that, more fragile, and perhaps more honest. The people of Eastwind Hollow were not known for their eloquence, but they understood endurance. And Eleonora, in the weeks since the fire, had become a kind of symbol of the hard, quiet work of choosing to remain. Her days began before light, as they always had. The triplets were growing quickly now, their cries fuller, their limbs stronger, their personalities beginning to pull apart like threads from a tightly woven cloth. Bram had a stubbornness that showed in the arch of his neck when he wanted to be fed first, in the set of his mouth when sleep refused to come. Mira had taken to watching light move across the walls, following every flicker and shadow with a gaze so focused that it often startled Eleonora into stillness. And Nessa laughed, not often, not wildly, but with a soft, gurgling joy that seemed to bubble up only when the world had gone completely quiet, as if her laughter came not from reaction, but from something she carried inside. Eleonora moved through their care with the grace of habit, her hands knowing the motions even before her mind had caught up. She had become something she had not known she could be, needed, not for what she might give in trade, not for her skill with a needle or her willingness to sweep hearts in silence, but for her breath, her arms, her voice. She had become the center of a small world, one shaped by hunger and warmth, sleep and song, the softness of skin against skin, and the weight of a child sleeping across her chest. There was no longer a hollow in her days. There was only rhythm. Outside, the village had changed as well, though it would not have seemed so to a stranger. The same stone paths twisted between cottages. The same chapel bell tolled once each morning, its sound dulled by snow-heavy air. The same lanterns were lit in the early dusk, their glow dimmed through frost-covered glass. But Eleonora saw it, the small shifts, the way the butcher now wrapped her meeting cloth instead of paper and placed it gently in her hands, the way children no longer stared openly at the babies, but instead smiled shyly when they passed, the way Mara Tulin paused when her paths crossed, not always to speak, but often enough to nod with something that almost resembled respect. One morning, as the snow began to fall in soft, slanting flurries, Eleonora stepped into square with Bram wrapped tight against her front and Mira and Nessa bundled together on her back. She moved slowly, her steps measured to avoid the slick patches of ice forming along the stones. A small group of women stood near the well, their voices hushed as they sorted winter apples and turnips. One of them, Dessa Klein, a woman known more for her silence than her charity, lifted her head and motioned toward Eleonora. "You've not had eggs in some time," she said, her voice sharp with the roughness of cold air. "Come by tomorrow. I'll have some ready." Eleonora paused, uncertain how to answer. She nodded barely and said only, "Thank you." It was not a gift. It was not pity. It was recognition. Later that week, a small bundle of willow switches was left at her door, tied in red thread. Strong, flexible, clean. For weaving, the note said. Nothing more. Eleonora brought them inside, laid them across her table, and stared at them for a long time before running her fingers over their bark. She had once made a basket in childhood. Her mother had taught her, briefly, on a summer's day before fever took her. She remembered the pattern, the crossing of strands, the way you had to soak the willow before it would bend without breaking. She looked down at the babies sleeping in their cradle and thought of baskets not as vessels for abandonment, but as proof that something could be made by hand, something strong, something meant to carry. That night, she began to weave. She worked slowly without hurry, her hands finding the rhythm as they moved. She sat by the fire with the babies near her feet, their breath mingling with the crackling of the wood. She wove until her back ached, until her fingers cramped, until the shape began to emerge. Not perfect, not even, but real. She did not know what it would carry yet, but she knew it would hold. By the time the first true snow blanketed Eastwind Hollow in silence, Eleanora's cottage had grown into something more than a room above a cobbler's shop. It had become a home. The cradle had been expanded with pine planks gifted quietly by the carpenter's apprentice. A second stool appeared beside the hearth, unasked for, but placed with care. A jar of dried thyme showed up on her windowsill, along with a length of blue wool and 3 wooden buttons. Each gift was left without name or note, as if the village, still too proud to say the words aloud, was learning to speak in actions. She hung the blue wool at the window and sewed the buttons into the triplets' cloaks. The thyme she steeped into tea. Each small kindness she accepted as one might take sunlight after weeks of cloud, not with triumph, but with reverence. Eleanora began to walk the edge of the river again, not daily, but when the weather allowed and the children were well fed and sleeping. She did not look for answers anymore. She no longer searched the banks for footprints or discarded names. The river had said all it would say, and now it watched her with the quiet of understanding. She would stand there for a time, letting the wind move through her hair and whisper the children's names, not into the water this time, but into the air. A reminder, a declaration, a rhythm. Nessa, Mira, Bram. They were her names now, too. Each time she spoke them, something settled deeper into her. Something became more certain. The village never asked her for a baptism. No one demanded papers or signatures or blood. The healer continued to check in quietly, more to see the children smile than to assess their health. And the council never reconvened. Some things, it seemed, resolved not through judgment, but through presence. Through seasons survived and hands kept steady. By the time winter reached its stillest point, when the sky seemed to hold its breath for days on end and the world outside moved as if underwater, Eleanora no longer wondered if she belonged. The question had faded. It had been answered not with permission, but with permanence. She had endured the eyes, the fire, the questions. She had stayed, and in staying, she had become. One evening, as snow drifted in soft spirals past a window and the baby slept soundly in the cradle, Eleanora sat at the table, holding the woven basket she had finally completed. It was sturdy now, shaped by hours and care. She lined it with a cloth, placed a sprig of heather inside, and set it near the door. It would not be used for carrying away, only for bringing in. Outside, the wind whispered across the hills, and the trees stood bare against the night. Inside, the fire glowed. And within that glow, Eleanora felt something stir. Not hope, not quite. Something deeper. The slow, steady warmth of belonging, earned by quiet persistence, sealed not in words, but in the cradle of 3 small breaths. By the time the river thawed again, its ice breaking into drifting shards that knocked against the banks like glass chimes in the wind, the children had learned to walk, not steadily, not without stumbles or bruises, but with a stubborn determination that marked their every movement. Bram was the first to try, his legs wide set, arms flailing at his sides as if balancing against unseen winds. He fell often but never cried, always pulling himself up with the same quiet grit that had been there in him from the first days. Nessa followed not long after, though she moved like a dancer, cautiously and with an uncanny grace that made her seem older than her years. Mira was last, not because she could not do it, but because she did not rush. She watched first, studied the motion of her siblings, and only when the ground beneath her seemed ready did she move forward, slow and sure, eyes wide with concentration. Eleanora watched each step with a reverence, so profound it quieted even her breath. She did not cheer. She did not call attention. She only opened her arms when they wavered, and they always found her. 3 winters had passed since the day the river gave them to her. The world had changed, not in grand or sudden strokes, but in the slow evolution of kindnesses and seasons. Eastwind Hollow remained a place of restraint and habit, of quiet piety and narrow roads, but it no longer turned its face from her. Children waved when they saw her pass. Neighbors stopped to ask after the little ones. Old men offered advice about shoes and teething remedies and when to begin teaching letters. The fire, once a specter of accusation, had become something they no longer mentioned aloud, and yet its smoke lingered in their memories, not as a warning, but as a turning point. She had not burned. She had stood, And over time, that standing became the soil for something like trust. The cottage had grown not in space, but in spirit. The cradle was long gone, replaced by small straw beds laid side by side beneath the window, each with its own woven blanket, its own carved toy. Eleonora made them by hand in the evenings, her fingers callous but precise. She had learned to stretch time thin and make it last, rising before the children stirred, working after they slept, her days full but never rushed. Her hair had silvered at the temples. Her back bent slightly more than it had, but she moved with a quiet power, a steadiness that did not need to be announced. She was not the same woman who had arrived with a single sack and too many silences. She had rooted herself. She had grown from grief, not away from it, but through it. That spring, the river called her again, not in voice, not in omen, but in the way it moved, swift and clear and expectant. The air was sweet with thawed soil and new grass, and the trees were the first dusting of green across their branches, like memory returning. The triplets had taken to walking farther each day, exploring the edge of the meadow, collecting stones and fallen twigs, asking questions Eleonora did not always know how to answer. They were curious, endlessly so, with minds that turned the world over like river stones in their palms. One morning, as the mist still curled low across the fields, Bram ran to her with Bird's feather clutch in his hand, wide-eyed with wonder. "It's for the river," he said, "so it knows we remember." Eleonora did not ask how he knew. She simply nodded and took the feather gently, placing it in her apron pocket like an offering. That evening, she led them to the riverbank for the first time since they had learned to walk. They followed her without question, their small feet tripping through the underbrush, their laughter carrying to the quiet woods like birdsong. She held their hands as they crossed the last patch of uneven ground, and when they reached the dock, they stood in silence. The river moved fast now, full with meltwater, its surface broken by swirling eddies and the occasional flash of sunlight caught on the current. The same dock, the same stretch of water, but it no longer held fear for her. It had become something else, a witness, a beginning. She sat at the edge, as she had years ago, and the children sat beside her, their legs dangling over the side, their eyes fixed on the water. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the feather Bram had found. Without speaking, she handed it to him. He stood, his feet planted wide for balance, and let it fall into the river. The feather drifted for a moment, then vanished from view. "It remembers," Mira said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Eleonora looked at her, struck again by the depth in the girl's eyes, the way she seemed to carry echoes that hadn't been spoken aloud. She reached for Myra's hand, and Nessa's too, and Bram's other, and they sat that way for a while, all four of them tethered together like roots in the soil. "I want to show them where we lived," Nessa said suddenly. "Before the river." Eleonora smiled. "You don't remember before the river?" Nessa nodded, not with pictures, just with feelings. Mira tilted her head. "Were we cold?" Eleonora looked out the water, the way it moved without end, always toward something. "Not anymore," she said. They stayed until the light faded, until the trees turned to silhouettes and the river began to mirror the sky. When they rose, the air was cooler and the ground damp beneath their soles. Eleonora led them back through the woods, and they walked without hurry, the silence between them full of trust. That night, after the children had been washed and fed and tucked into bed, Eleonora sat by the hearth, mending one of Bram's shirts. The thread caught in the fabric, a small resistance, and she paused, needle poised. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the windows with a soft rhythm of breath. She thought of all the places she had lived, all the beds she had slept in alone, all the days spent surviving but not living. Then she looked across the room to the small sleeping shapes, the rise and fall of their chests, the way Mira curled toward Nessa in her sleep, the way Bram always pushed the blanket down to his waist. And she knew, with a clarity that needed no language, that this was what legacy looked like. Not a name carved into stone, not a tale passed down in books, but 3 children who would grow and remember, not everything, but enough Enough to know that love does not always arrive with ceremony, that family can be chosen without permission, that what is saved can be more powerful than what is lost. They would remember a woman who pulled them from the cold and taught them how to stand. Years from now, she knew they would ask questions about their beginning. They would want to know who had carried them before her, why they were left, what name they had before she named them. She would answer what she could. She would tell them the truth where truth was gentle, and offer silence where silence was merciful. And in time, they would find their own language for belonging. But tonight, there was only this: the soft creak of wood beneath her feet, the gentle hiss of the fire, the knowledge that the river still ran and the wind still spoke, and the warmth of the lives she had woven into her own. She set the shirt aside, stood, and crossed the room to the window. Outside, the moon had risen, casting silver over the quiet world. She pressed her palm to the glass and closed her eyes. In the hush of the moment, she did not speak. She did not need to. The river knew. The wind knew. And somewhere deep within the steady rhythm of breath and love and time, the story of her life, their life, flowed on, not loudly, not in fame or legend, but in the way all lasting things do, carried forward by memory, made sacred by care, and held forever in the hearts of those who were never meant to be lost.